How important is Sedgefield to you?
This is the place I have most roots in Durham. And this is the place I feel I come from. So the roots are very strong emotionally and personally. It had a big impact on then the development of my politics, and in the days gone by when we tried to build the Labour Party here, I very much saw it as a metaphor for how the Labour Party should develop.
I want to thank all the people of Sedgefield, of Bishop Auckland, of Stockton South, Darlington, North West Durham, Clyde Valley, and Redcar.
For decades, the British Labour Party have held a group of seats in the north of England known as the Red Wall. But then, in the winter of 2019, a political earthquake happened. A democratic revolution. Suddenly, the Conservative Party achieved the unthinkable. It seized seats that had been Labour strongholds for decades, or since their creation in some cases.
I'm here next to the West Stanley Colliery Disaster of 1909 Memorial, and it's a really quite astonishing and thought-provoking piece because it tells us of the 168 men and boys that were killed in one of the worst pest disasters that this country has ever seen. One of them, of course, being a relative of mine, Thomas Shepherd, on my granddad's side of the family. My granddad then went down and worked in the mines himself throughout his life for many years, to the extent where he couldn't fully extend his arm anymore because of that holding that drill for such a long time. I'm here because I think it tells us just how much coal runs through County Durham's veins, how much the trade union movement runs through County Durham's veins, how much the Labour Party runs through County Durham's veins. That's why it's absolutely extraordinary that this place in 2021 saw Durham County Council lose overall control of that council. Labour lost control in County Durham. It's been Labour since 1919, over 100 years of the Labour Party being here and being in power. It was often said that you could stick a red rosette on a donkey here in County Durham and it would be guaranteed to win. I want to know what's changed. What has meant that a town of miners and a town of proud working people have turned their back on the Labour Party? What's going on? I'll be hearing from MPs and ordinary people to investigate just that question.
My name's David Skelton. I'm the author of a book called The New Snobbery.
And what is the new snobbery then? Because I sort of immediately imagine Emily Thornberry sort of sneering at England's national flag.
Sneering is a good word. Emily Thornberry is a good example. And a lot of this for me goes back to the Brexit referendum. Working class Leave voters being described as stupid, bigoted, even worse than that. And you had an immediate attempt to almost overturn the referendum. If you're basically saying that some voters are not educated enough to take a part in the process, that's almost Victorian. That's almost an Edwardian idea that some voters, the elite, the Metro Remainer elite, are more intelligent, more refined, and more able to make a democratic decision than working class Leave voters. An elite who look down on the rest of the population.
The Labour Party it seems to have lost touch with, dare I say, it does sound slightly patronising, but ordinary people. And by ordinary people, I mean basically everyone, except for a certain class of probably quite metropolitan people, university educated usually, who have very specific concerns, often to do with identity, want to nanny people, and do feel a certain aversion at what, again, I would say ordinary people are interested in.
What's it like being a Conservative then on campus at Durham?
It's a dangerous game, definitely. I know a lot of people, it's one of the first, during Freshers Week, it's quite toxic at Durham. The culture at Durham is very toxic, especially for someone from like a working class background, from Stanley, South Moor. A lot of time they'd ask what you're studying, then they'd say what school did you go to, and they'd all expect to list a famous private school. A lot of them went to Eton. I just went with a comprehensive in Lanchester. But I'd also say, are you a Tory, Labour? And that's when the sneering would begin.
Yeah.
There's quite a few Tories at Durham, not as many as at other universities, but it's really toxic. They'll start sneering at you. There's a lot of connotations with being, like, if you're surrounded, there's a lot of connotations as a conservative. It's typically you must be a racist, xenophobic, homophobic, and it's just endless. And a lot of people don't want anything to do with you. They don't want to speak to you at all. I remember when I was head boy, I had a meeting with Laura Pidcock. She came to my old school, and I still remember it was around the same time she said, I wouldn't want to be friends or speak to a conservative. I was like, no, do you want to speak to me at all then? And it just shows how quite immature and intolerable people are, especially young people.
Do you find then that with your right-wing mates, do you always assume that actually it's the left who are the intolerant ones? I assume you don't view the left as being evil or
no, definitely
anything
not.
like that?
Definitely not. I'm always happy to have a good, healthy debate, but it's always from the same group of people, the far left. They're always the first ones to quickly point out you must be racist, xenophobic. That's how they end the debate. You're just instantly regarded and labelled as something which you're clearly not.
The party broadly now is a party of social activists and students and middle-class liberals living in our fashionable cities and university towns. People who have fundamentally lost touch, I think, with blue-collar Britain, with small-town Britain, with what you might call provincial Britain, and worse than that, not just lost touch with those parts of Britain, but in some cases are privately contemptuous of those parts of Britain, and every now and then publicly contemptuous. You mentioned the Emily Thornberry tweet. I mean, it was obviously the Gordon Brown, Gillian Duffy encounter, and every now and then I think the mask slips, and people inside the Labour Party who are of that view that I explained will sometimes lay bare their own prejudices. So yes, I mean there is that snobbery, and it's no surprise to me, at least, as someone who's been rooted in the Labour movement for 26 years, whatever it is now, that has resulted in a very serious schism between, if you like, the traditional working class blue collar communities of Britain and the Labour Party, and that's been played out in recent years in the most destructive way for the Labour Party, particularly as we saw at the 2019 general election.
Yeah, because you mentioned the Gillian Duffy episode. I mean, that was over a decade ago now. So just how far back, in your opinion, does this go? Because I guess the narrative from commentators out there in the sort of blue check Twitter world would be that this is entirely, the last general election was entirely down to the Brexit vote. But actually, Paul, if you look at the local elections this year, the Labour lost Durham County Council for the first time since 1919. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, I think, and you know, I say this in my book, I think that this trend has been going on for actually about 30 years now. I think you can probably trace it to the late 80s, early 90s, when Labour kind of began to ditch any pretense at being an avowedly sort of working class party. It started to embrace the EU. It started to become much more middle class in its demographic, in its outlook. The priorities and messaging of the party became much more those of the kind of upwardly mobile urban middle class than it did the traditional working class. And that process, I think, accelerated under Tony Blair, and I think actually if you look at the statistics, the working class have been moving away from the Labour Party for the best part of that period, really.
So Howie, public sector, you must be a Labour man through and through, aren't you?
Well, actually I was, until the last election. Then I actually found it impossible to vote for them.
Why? What happened?
Well, basically, I lost total trust with them. It was trust issues.
Did you vote Leave?
Yes, I did vote Leave, and that was one part of the trust issue, because of the fact Leave won the referendum. And for me, what was most disappointing was that Labour actually came out and said that they would respect the referendum result. And they absolutely didn't.
But I found when I was going around campaigning, speaking to people, I was getting a really strong message. They felt that they'd been betrayed by the Labour Party, they'd been ignored by the Labour Party. They felt that they were called racist by the Labour Party and stupid just for voting for Brexit. And they said they've ignored our voice. And so many people said, I'm going to do the unthinkable. They were going to vote Conservative. It was quite obvious. I wasn't surprised by the result that night.
You did vote Labour in the past. What is it that's preventing you from doing so in the future? Why do you think you've
identity
lost?
politics,
Right.
the voters, the way they treat people in the centre, it's just insane. It's a bad reflection on the party. I don't want to think the party's like that, but it has shown in the past that, well, the recent past, that it has been like that.
No one can doubt the earthquake that was the 2019 general election. But are these shifts in political allegiance going to be permanent?
That must have been quite the night the day after that election in 2019.
Well, I think it was, Darren. I think it was quite a night for quite a lot of people. I think you included, actually.
Well, do you think then there's much to the argument that 2019 was just a fluke? Because we've seen this year in the local elections, Durham County Council, Labour have lost control.
Yeah. No, they have. And so I'll just put that in a bit of context for you. So 4 years ago, in the Northwest Durham constituency, I did the numbers on it, and actually the Conservatives came fourth there, in terms of numbers of votes. This year we came first. Right, that shows you that actually that progress is continuing. It's not going to be without hard work, but I think local people have seen the hard work that people like me, Deanna, Paul, Peter in Darlington, and Matt Vickers down in Stockton, we're all putting into our areas, and they can also see that transformation that's happened in Teesside, I think with Ben Houchin, which I think has been a real driver on those local elections. So actually the key thing was we saw turnout was quite significantly up in the areas we were really pushing. So I think that's a really good sign as well.
If you look at the membership of the Labour Party, they still don't really like patriotism. You see them have a spasm of outrage every time anyone sings a national anthem or waves the flag. And that is so detached from working class communities. And something I would say is Labour have lost 2 heartlands in 10 years. And what we saw in Scotland, it wasn't a one election only thing. Once you lose heartlands, once people start making the move, then historically and globally, it's often very unlikely people go back.
The issue is this, is that across, I think, Western Europe, the affiliations to parties breaking down. People don't automatically vote the same way at every elections. I saw that certainly when I was elected in 2001. Added to that, areas like this, I think some commentators see it as red wall seats, they're all a stereotypical lot. Well, I'm sorry, it's not. It's changed. It's changed in the last 20 years. And the proud industrial past you refer to, Darren, is right. But that's the past. North Durham today is very different from when I was first elected in 2001. And so if you put those two things together, what the Labour Party's got to do is have that sense of community which is still there and relate to it. And I think quite successfully do that in North Durham. Other parts, possibly that has broken down.
What is it that you're getting right here then that other Labour Party candidates aren't getting right?
Well, I've always prided myself. I said this in 2001 when I was first elected to my local party. This constituency will change. And what you've got to do is be seen, get out there, talk to people, argue with people. You don't have to necessarily agree all the time, but be seen as visual. And I think fair to local councils, etc., the same. They just get into the community, and that's what we've got to do.
One of the more recent phenomenons that have shifted political allegiances has been the rise of the so-called culture wars or woke issues, where the Labour Party have often been perceived as siding against working class values of family and patriotism.
No, I think that there's a real mistake here because people imagine that the only thing that drives or motivates people politically is whether they can gain a few quid out of it. And as I say, that was a mistake which the Remainers made in relation to Brexit. They thought if they kept threatening people economically in their jobs, they wouldn't vote for sovereignty because that was far too abstract a concept, or democratic accountability. Why would anyone, that doesn't, don't get any money out of it. And they made a terrible error there, didn't they? We've seen that some of the issues that looked like they were just kind of slightly barking student issues around free speech, around, nobody was ever going to think that statues would be a national issue because it was confined to Oxford University, Oriel College and Cecil Rhodes and that statue. But then it became a national discussion because of what happened in relation to the Black Lives Matters, understandable initial explosion of fury around racism that turned into a cultural discussion that led to a major discussion on statues. I don't think we should cry culture wars every 5 minutes, but the culture wars are actually a cultural shift that's attempting to change people's behaviour and their attitudes to a very narrow prescriptive view of what would make a good citizen. And ordinary citizens go, what? And it would be absolutely ludicrous if any political party didn't understand that that has a detrimental impact on a free society.
They don't connect with the ordinary voter, especially with Labour voters in the Red Wall. There's zero connection. People in the Red Wall want good jobs, good education. They're not bothered about gender neutral. It's just not on the map.
I do think on things like, for example, sort of quiet patriotism that I think is evident in this patch, where there is a sense that the Labour Party is full of the likes of Emily Thornberry who sneer at St George's flag, or those who do not like flying the flag. The Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, had the flag behind him, and there were Labour MPs tweeting about this, mocking alongside the BBC. So
Darren, I would say those colleagues stay off Twitter if that's all you can say about it. Look, I'm patriotic. I believe there's great things about this country. Working class communities do love this country. They want it to be proud, and I think what we've got to be portraying is that tolerance and respect for difference. Also, the issue that do we want security? Yeah, we do. People want security, whether it be police on their streets or whether it ensures in terms of national level in terms of our armed forces. And we should be proud of them. Because remember again, most of the people that serve in our armed forces come from working class communities like this. They're not separate people. So no, I've spent my life in Parliament supporting the armed force, and I'll continue to do so proudly.
Isn't the problem though that you've got many colleagues that don't, or don't appear to at least?
Well, you've got some, but you've got the same differences in any other party in terms of the Conservative Party. But what I would say is, if you want to actually ensure that we're listened to, defence, for example, is like the wallpaper in the room at elections. I don't get ever changes people's vote, but if people know it's not there, they certainly recognise it's not there.
So, if Labour voters were genuinely sincere in voting Tory, and it wasn't just a protest vote, I wanted to know what the Tories would need to do to keep these votes for the longer term.
Brexit, obviously, the big one. We've delivered on that. I think it's that's been huge, and actually repaying that trust, as the Prime Minister said. I was at Sedgefield Cricket Club with him the day after the general election when he was, very clear. This is about repaying the trust that people have placed in us. We've got to do that. We've done it with Brexit. We've now got to do it with levelling up. The COVID situation, whatever you think of it, has been a massive hit on the UK and actually the global economy. We have to deal with that, but we've also got to do as much as we can to do that levelling up stuff. I've got bids in for restoring your railways funds. I've got for cycle paths. I've got it for. I've got some. I want to get a bid in, hopefully, for Crook, Willington and Tower Law for that levelling up fund. We've got to show some delivery. But the biggest thing, actually, which really gets me and what I continue to fight on, is that sort of technical and vocational education stuff.
The creation of high quality jobs in local towns and local areas. So we hear a lot about social mobility. But the dogma of social mobility is that the clever 1 or 2% in the school do well, leave town, go to university, and don't come back. Now we need that dogma of social mobility to become about creating good jobs within towns. So it's not about geographic mobility, it's about people staying in their hometown and building it up and strengthening it. But I think it's important for the Tory party to be about empowering communities, these communities which have been forgotten, giving people real power in their streets, in their towns, in their villages.
One area in which people, I think a lot of parents are concerned about, is this idea that my kids are going to be worse off than I am because of the housing crisis, for example.
Yeah. I've got huge amounts of brownfield development sites in my constituency. I think even the village in which I've got a house, you know, I've got a large site there which is derelict for decades.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea that we shouldn't be pushing some of that brownfield redevelopment to see new housing there is crazy to me. I think there is a bigger issue across parts of the north of England where actually towns have seen actually over quite a few decades, in some cases, decrease in population.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, some of those holes in the towns which have grown up because buildings got knocked down and demolished. And actually, for some of them, this is actually about transforming high streets as well. I want to see more people living in our town centres. I don't want to see us constantly pumping money into high streets just to sort of redo the hanging baskets and a bit of paving slabs, as you'll have often seen. I want to see people, those as living, thriving places, because if you can get more people into the town centres, actually that creates entirely the environment you're after. Great infrastructure, great jobs, good education system, and then keeping those people there in those good jobs.
One concern that I and other Conservative voters have is that in order to keep the red wall voters, the Tories will move sharply to the left on policy.
Now, Victoria, this morning I've had conversations with other commentators in the political world that are, I guess, more leaning towards the Conservative Party. Now, they've been saying things like, in what will be quite the, I think, diversion from what perhaps the Tory stereotype once was, on being pro-market, pro-business, pro-enterprise, all of those three things. They actually are calling for a more interventionist state as a way in which you can keep so-called red wall voters on side. Are you minded to agree that that's the only way that you can keep the red wall on side?
Well, I think for a start, I'd slightly push back on the idea that that is, goes against the grain of Tory Conservative Party philosophy. Arguably it was the free market policies of the Thatcher governments in the 80s that went against the grain, and actually Conservative Party-led governments have generally actually been pretty keen on intervening in the economy, or generally going along with the then, in the 70s, for example, going along with interventionist
post-war consensus
policies, exactly, which of course we all know drove this country into a pretty bad state in the late 70s. That actually it was the free market policies managed to turn around and set us back towards prosperity. I think people in the north and the northeast would welcome more investment in infrastructure. Policies like reopening certain railway connections in South Northumberland will be tremendously popular, and rightly so. And there is a good free market argument for government investing in that kind of infrastructure, because that can yield important multipliers for job creation and connectivity, which is something I'm definitely open to.
Yeah.
But then I think also we should be looking at other things that I think people in the North and Midlands are sold short on, which is, for example, education. Educational standards measured by local authority are much lower in the North and the Midlands than they are in London and the South. So how about we focus on educational outcomes as a way of levelling up? People don't really seem to talk about that very much. We have been rather fixated on the differences in achievement between ethnic groups, which is not to say that's not important and interesting. But to me, when you look at the educational map, that difference in educational standards between North and South is really quite stark.
Right. Now we have the Tories. What are they doing? They say they're going to level up. But when we actually look at what they're talking about, they're bringing in legislation, particularly in relation to environmental legislation, and they've got this net zero target, which actually is all about, in my opinion, inevitably will lead to a degrowth strategy. It means quite a lot of industries are ruled out as not being appropriate for net zero. It means enforcing on households that they have to have a particular type of car or not drive at all. So they've implemented situations in households as well, where they say what kind of central heating you're going to have. All of this is going to cost a fortune.
Yeah.
But more than that, it basically says the only kind of industrialization that's allowed is green industrialization, and there really is a limit to the number of green jobs you can. I mean, apart from people who have got clipboards coming around inspecting whether you've got your right kind of boiler, or shouting at you for not recycling or what have you. I mean, what are the jobs that we're talking about? There just is not an industrial strategy that would involve so many millions of people. People keep saying to me, oh, it'll be great because we can have car mechanics who are kind of experts in electrical cars. But what about the car mechanics who are experts in cars, full stop, who are actually going to be squeezed out? Or the car manufacturers who can only now produce electric cars if you fit in with the government schemes. So you can get my drift. I'm anxious that the industrial strategy, at the very minimum, does not afford the kind of levelling up they promise. But worse than that, it's got exactly the same condescension. It says we, the experts, understand that we've got to do this for net zero. It's been decided somewhere, nowhere near you, anti-democratic. We're imposing it top down on you. Well, isn't that what they just rejected in so many mainstream political arenas previously?
How will you avoid making the same mistakes as, say, the Labour government in the 1970s did? Some people would argue on a more market-focused side of the argument that actually you're just trying to pick winners, and that hasn't worked in the past, so why would it work now? Second question would be, doesn't the sort of net zero target preclude much of what you've just mentioned? Because it's going to hurt disproportionately those who are working class in constituencies not unlike North West Durham hardest.
So take those two in a row. First of all, so Darren, I don't think you would be arguing against that enormous economic investment that was pushed by Mrs. T in the mid-80s into Sunderland, right? Government can be a catalyst. What it can't be doing is propping up the past. What it's got to be is supporting innovation and growth for the future. I think there are two separate things there. I think it's difficult to do that, but it's not impossible to do it. Other countries have done it all around the world. You look at the powerhouses of East Asia and how they transformed from basically agrarian economies in the 40s and 50s to technological superpowers of today. Look at the way they've done it in Germany, the way they've enabled that constant progress. I think one of the interesting aspects of the PM speech the other day was, you look at the difference between what happened with East Germany and West Germany, and now even the GDP per head in East Germany, which was so much lower than it was in, say, places like the north of England or Wales, now above. But that's what happens when you've got government investment, but not to prop up failure, but to promote success. And I think that's, rather than picking winners, we need to be backing winners, if you see what I mean. And I think on the other side, on net zero, the government is heading in a direction, the world is heading in a direction on this. I think we can really be a leader in decarbonised industries. Now, whether or not whatever your views on climate change are, I think that nobody wants to see polluting cars down roads in towns like Consett, and I think there's actually if we can look at green alternatives to that. Also, you look in places like Weardale in my patch, we're looking at all sorts of exploration in terms of mining. Actually, some of those historic industries, probably in a very different context to the way they were, a couple of centuries ago at the height of the Industrial Revolution. But if we can, and you've got lithium being looked at down in Cornwall as well. If the UK can be doing it from start to finish, I don't want to see us dependent on foreign oil or foreign gas from Russia or the Middle East. I also don't want to see us dependent on importing some of these rare earth metals from other unstable parts of the world. As much as we can do it in the UK, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to push on. And as the UK is no longer a net energy exporter, North Sea oil is coming towards the end of its life, then I don't want to see us dependent on overseas countries around the world for our energy.
So can Labour do anything to win back their former voters? Is Sir Keir Starmer helping them in that challenge, that monumental challenge?
What would the Labour Party have to do? How would it have to change in order to win the vote of people like yourself? Do you reckon?
Move more centrist.
You think it's very much on the left right now?
Oh, aye. I wouldn't even get a look in at the minute. But yeah, to be honest, Keir Starmer is quite centrist. So I respect them for trying to get him in.
Yeah.
But I mean, like I say, like I just previously said, it's a lot of the voters as well. Like the attacking anyone, write them out.
I think they're still ignoring what working people want. I think they're looking now for other voters. They've taken the Northern Labour voters for granted for so long, and they've become, to me, sort of the woke party. They just seem to be bothered about identity politics, where people just want the real issues, their everyday lives. You know, they want jobs, they want houses. They don't want to be told that they're thinking the wrong way or they're saying the wrong thing all the time, and they want to have their voices heard. I know I don't really think that Labour has it's still not addressing all the issues it's been experiencing, and people are still very disillusioned with Labour. I personally can't see them getting in under Keir Starmer, and I don't know who else they would get in under. I can't see any potential candidate to take over as the lead.
The Labour Party has always been a coalition. It's always been that, what I call the Hampstead and Hartlepool coalition, the kind of middle-class, white-collar, liberal, progressive element on one hand, but the greater part of the coalition was always the Hartlepool element, the blue-collar, kind of traditional representative of small-town Britain, working-class values and so on. And the Labour Party at its best has always managed to hold that coalition together. The problem increasingly over the last 30 years, and particularly I think the second part of that period, is that coalition has just become fundamentally unbalanced, and the Hampstead element of it has come to dominate, and Hartlepool has been elbowed out. And I think that there are many people who, I mean, you could, you know, going back in history, you look at the Labour benches in Parliament, and actually they were filled with working class MPs from a working class background, often people who had kind of worked in manual labour, they'd come up through the trade union movement, they'd worked in the shipyards, the docks, whatever. Now, I know obviously there's been deindustrialisation and we don't have a lot of those industries to the extent that we once did. But even so, if you compare that to now, and the number of MPs who are university educated, middle class, often go off to work for a charity or a think tank, or they become a researcher for a politician, and then 1, 2, 3, they're straight into Parliament in a safe seat without any kind of real experience of the real world, or what it is to work in the private sector, what it is to struggle on a wage, to pay a mortgage, etc. So the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, is I think fundamentally unrepresentative of large parts of working class Britain, and you know that is a big part of the reason why that schism has emerged, I think.
And that's just it. What you've heard time and again throughout this short film is about that schism that's emerged and perhaps been highlighted since the vote for Brexit. That quiet democratic revolution, a revolution that almost was quashed by a political elite that couldn't stand the outcome. Is Sir Keir Starmer QC the right man to bridge that gap between Labour's strongholds like Hampstead and the increasingly disillusioned one-time Labour voters in places like Hartlepool up here? I'm not so sure, and I haven't heard anything from anyone to suggest he is. That said, folks, the Conservative Party can't afford to grow complacent. These voters are now alive to the fact that their vote and their voice matters, that their vote and their voice can bring about change. If they don't deliver on the promises of both Brexit and of that 2019 general election, there's nothing to suggest that the tribal loyalty of the politics of old is coming back anytime soon. British politics is going through a once-in-a-generation transformation. It's going to be fascinating to see where it all ends up. I've been Darren Grimes for Reasoned UK. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.